Today, and I have got a great program for you. Joining me today is Tom Green, and Tom is here with some of his friends and flags, friends and flags, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So a great entertaining and educating program about the flags of the United States. But before we do that, though, we want to introduce to you these other distinguished gentlemen that are standing beside us. So I will just hand the mic down, and if you will just tell me what your current and maybe what your past name is. I know Three Willie down there, he's sometimes confused. Is he Dale or is he Three-Legged Willie? Yeah. So welcome, Mr. Bailey.
I'm Michael Bailey. I'm with the Sons of the American Revolution. My Revolutionary War ancestor is Jonathan Pitts. He served in the war, Revolutionary War in the state of North Carolina.
My name is Tom Houston. My ancestor, Revolutionary War, is Joseph Collier. He was also in the state of South Carolina during that period.
Hi, my name is Carl Hill. I'm a past president of the Sugar Land chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution. My ancestor was Thomas Saunders, who was in the Virginia militia, and I also had another ancestor, Peter Poland, that crossed the Delaware River with George Washington and fought in the Battle of Trenton.
My name is Dale Williamson. My ancestor was Micaiah Williamson, Revolutionary War ancestor, and he was Three-Legged Willie's grandfather.
Hello, my name is Ron Brown. My ancestor was Solomon Brown. He was from Pennsylvania, died in the Revolutionary War. One of his ancestors was Alexander Brown, who was my Sons of the Republic of Texas ancestor. He fought in the Battle of San Jacinto.
So all of you gentlemen have ancestors who fought in American and Texas Revolutions. Mm-hmm. And you're going to now show us and tell us some of the flags that flew over our great country 200, 300 years ago?
That's right.
Great, great. Well, thank you very much for joining us here today. Can't wait to get started and telling you and showing you what we've got planned for you today. Tom, we're here now with our first two flags. We have Michael and Carl holding them up for us. And tell me a little bit about these two flags.
Okay. Well, as you know, this is our current American flag, the 50-star flag, right? You say the pledge to this every morning here at school? So you know what the 50 stars stand for, right? And you know what the 13 stripes stand for, right? Now, when I was your age, well, not quite your age, a little older than you, this was our flag, which has 48 stars on it. We never thought it would change. Did you ever think about this might change? The most likely 51st state right now is Puerto Rico. So we may have a 51-star flag soon. But when we were kids, we didn't ever think, did you, Carl? I never thought it would change. Remember when it changed? 1959. 2 new states came into the Union the same year, 1959. Any of you remember who they were?
Who? Hawaii
right.
and Alaska, exactly right. You know, this is just one way that you will be able to tabulate and count change in your life if you have the opportunity for a flag, for a star to be added to your flag. So thank you very much. You know, this is a very precious emblem of ours because not only are these gentlemen representing their ancestors, but their ancestors' commitment to our country. And they're continuing on with that education, that information, because, you know, Texas and American history is so important to the world. And, you know, there's so much that we can just learn from these flags that I'm anxious for you to hear about it. So thank you very much, Michael and Carl.
One of the little details I want you to think about is the fact that in 1959, when that happened, the Flag Act had been changed, and we didn't add both stars in 1959. And the Flag Act had been changed to say that we will not add the star until the next July the 4th, and that's the way we do it today. So, which was the first of the 2 states that came in? Do you remember?
Hawaii and Alaska.
Yeah, but do you remember which one was first?
Hawaii or Alaska? I don't think I know.
You got a 50-50 chance of guessing that one. I remember it by Hawaii 5-0. That's what they call their police. So Alaska was the 49th state. They came in January, and so on July the 4th, 1959, the 48-star flag was retired, and we had a 49-star flag for 1 year.
Huh.
And so then Hawaii came in August, and so they had to wait until July the 4th, 1960. And so the birthday of the current flag is July the 4th, 1960. That's a good trivia question, by the way. Most people don't seem to know that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that flag nut characteristic of yours. What started this this journey with flags?
Started me?
Yeah.
I started because of a man who was a World War II veteran in New Braunfels, where I lived at the time, and he was doing a very short program for school children with 6 American flags. And I would help him do them, and I noticed the kids were bored and they didn't seem to care much about it. So he got sick one day, and he asked me to do it for him, and I had 3 or 4 of these that were different, and I brought them, and the kids were interested in those, you know, so that's how I started
That began
collecting
it,
them.
and since then...
Once you collect something and people know it, that's what happens.
That's right, because you do quite a few programs on this, don't you? All sorts of people have received this. Oh, look how pretty. I like this one.
Now, this one some of you may have seen. A few years ago, they found one of those Norwegian longboats. It's 1,000 years old, see, and it was in the ice, buried up in Newfoundland. And it was whole. It was complete.
Huh.
They think maybe it was actually used as a burial because it was in too good a shape to
Have gone through some sort of...
Yeah. Didn't look like it
Didn't look like it had been used.
It had been used, yeah. So on the bow of those longboats, you may have those pictures in your textbook. It has a big long curved part, and there's an image carved on the end of it, and that was supposed to scare the sea monsters away because remember, they were very superstitious. This is the symbol of the raven that they carved onto the front of that little boat. A friend of that gave me that the other day. So that's
a
a
nice
vexillological banner. Okay, now let's move on up to England, because that's the winners are the ones that get to write the history books, right? And so that's why your history book has so much of English influence on it. I will end, though, with Texas by saying that the first Thanksgiving in this part of the world was held in Texas 23 years before the Pilgrims ever got here.
Wow.
Near El Paso,
Now,
Texas.
that's a great piece of trivia information.
And that's not in the textbook
either.
either.
El Paso.
El Paso, Texas, in Isleta. Okay, this was the flag that our forefathers, all of us that are here, would have seen probably every day of their life if they lived anywhere near the coast, because the naval ships of England would have been flying this. This is the red ensign, as it's called, or the Queen Anne flag. That's another name for it. They had a blue flag like this and a white flag like this, and England was the largest navy in the world at that time. And so they had 3 different fleets. And so they had the white fleet, the red fleet, and the blue fleet. The red fleet was primarily in America, so this was the flag that our ancestors would have seen, and it would have been their flag because most of them were English. Now, remember this flag, because we're going to talk about it again in a little minute, about how you could easily convert this into another flag, but I'll get into that when we bring the other flag out. But let's talk a little bit, though. What does it have up here in the top? Do you know anything about those crosses? What they represent? You know one of them. We just talked about Andrew's cross, the X-shaped cross. See, so this is the X-shaped cross. Now, what about this one? Kind of like the red cross. Okay, we're going to talk about it again in a minute when we get to it. So I want you to remember the red ensign, okay? Now, you'll read about this in your textbook if your teacher hadn't already gotten to that part already. The English and the colonists got really crossways with each other. And they had a lot of problems, and there was a lot of acts that were passed by the Parliament. And one of them was to tax the people of the colonies to pay for the cost of the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. Now, every war, y'all are a little too young to really realize this, but every war almost has been caused by the previous war. By the way, we don't take care of the details at the end, and that's exactly what happened. England had spent more money on the French and Indian War, even though they won, than America has spent on the war in Iraq today. So they were broke. They thought that the colonists had benefited most from the victory, and so they expected us to pay for it. Doesn't sound that unreasonable to us today, does it? Except you have to remember people had never paid taxes directly at that point. Taxes were always hidden by the federal excise tax, things like that. So there was one of those tax acts. Have you studied any of those? Have y'all had American history yet? Some of you have, right? You remember the Townsend Act, the Intolerable Acts, the Tea Act, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act. Remember all those? You remember how you loved the test? Did you have to remember the dates all of them were passed? Didn't you love running all those days? No, not really. Well, one of those was the most important. It was the Stamp Act. It caused such a furor that a group of men from 8 of the colonies got together in New York City, not in Philadelphia where most of the things took place, and they started a secret group called the Sons of Liberty. And this was their first flag. Only 8 of the 14, really, colonies showed up. One of them never showed up, or we'd have a 14-star flag, a striped flag. And so they immediately got together, formed their organization, and said, we're going to boycott everything made in England. And I want you all to go back.
Taxed.
Yeah, because they don't want to pay all that tax.
Yeah, you buy it, and they're going to add a tax to it. That tax goes to the country. So they said no taxes.
That was our first Sons of Liberty flag.
And that was their flag to signify their united commitment to that. Oh.
Now that was in 1765. We say that the American Revolution basically started in the 1770s, 73, 5 in that period, and then 1776 when we declared our independence. But from 1765 on forward, we finally convinced 13 of the 15 colonies that existed at the time into supporting our efforts. And so that's how we ended up with the Sons of Liberty flag, and probably that's the beginning of the American flag, wouldn't you think? All we need is the stars on it, and we've got our American flag. So remember this one and that Queen Anne flag I talked to you about. We're going to combine those in a minute, and you'll see what I'm talking about. As the shooting actually got started, some of you have read the poem that starts out with, listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of...
Who? Paul Revere.
Now, nobody had ever remembered Paul Revere until that man wrote that poem. And the poem was written nearly 100 years after he died. So that's kind of the sad part of the story. But his efforts and the others, the colonists, really began the war. It's called the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It was April the 19th, 1875. Paul Revere said to one of his friends, if you'll put one light in the old church steeple or 2 lights, depending on whether they're coming by land or sea. Remember anything about that? 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Well, that's really kind of silly. If you look at a map of Boston, it's almost an island. The only thing they could get off by walking was through a swamp and going the wrong way. So they knew they were going by sea. They didn't have any choice. He really wanted to know when they were going to leave.
Yeah.
And so he rides off in the middle of the night to go warn everybody, and the British captured him. He really didn't warn hardly anybody. But other men did. And people brought thousands of militiamen from all over that part of the area. Well, one of the groups that came from a place called New Bedford, Massachusetts, brought their flag with them. Flags weren't really important in those days. Only the royal people had flags, you know, and there were no state flags and no colonial flags and things like that. And so this was an old flag that the Putnam family had saved for generations. It dates back to 1602.
Been in the attic?
Yeah.
But it united their guys, united their soldiers.
So this was our first battle flag. One of them brought it to the Old North Bridge, north of Concord, where the first shot was fired, heard round the world. You'll hear that phrase as you go through your studies. And this was our first battle flag. Okay? I've seen the original, still exists in the museum there in Bedford. Okay, the next major battle, which happened in June of that same year, 1775, was the Battle of Bunker Hill. So I have another trivia question for you. Where was the Battle of Bunker Hill fought?
It's kind of like who's buried in Grant's tomb.
Yeah.
Where was the Battle of Bunker Hill fought? Get it? Bunker Hill.
Wrong.
Oh! You led me there.
Another great trivia question. The musket, remember we told you the musket was very inaccurate, wouldn't shoot very far? Bunker Hill is where the town is, Charlestown is today. You couldn't hit anybody from there. They were too far away. So they had to get up closer so they could kill each other better. So they moved up to what's called Breed's Hill. So the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought on Breed's Hill.
Okay, all right.
Well, hanging outside of the monument that's there at Breed's Hill, and the monument doesn't have any information about that either, is this flag. Now, remember I showed you that red cross there the other day? This was the English flag. It had been the flag since the English and the French went down to Jerusalem during the Crusades, 1095. So this is an old flag. And they had seen it down there in Italy, and King Richard said, this will make a good symbol for us. So ever since then, that's been the flag of England. Not Great Britain, but England. So when you see a soccer game between England and France, or even Ireland, or Switzerland, or Scotland, which are all part of Great Britain, right? But they show this flag for the English flag. See the little tree up in the top? England had run out of trees large enough to make masts for their ships long before they ever came over here. So you can imagine how excited they were when they saw all of those big giant trees along the East Coast.
Yeah, we got masts galore.
That was our best product. That was our #1 export for years, turpentine and lumber. Okay? Now, I don't think this flag, unfortunately, was at Bunker Hill. That's the sad part about that. Because there was a man named Trumbull who was a pretty good artist, and he painted all those beautiful portraits that you'll see of the battle scenes when you finally visit New York or Washington, D.C. And in his portrait that he painted there at Bunker Hill is this flag in the background. And so my guess is that this is probably the flag that was flying there. Now notice the cross is gone. Now this was 1775, right? In 1635, that's a long time back, right? One of the separatists, you know, we created the word pilgrim. They didn't call themselves pilgrims. They were separatists, as they call themselves, because they didn't want to have anything to do with the English religion. And so they had already decided that it was inappropriate to use Christian symbols on secular flags. So that other flag, or flags like that were common in New England in that day, Roger Williams, some of you may have read about him. He came over as one of the separatists in 1635, and he told Governor Endicott, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which took out most of New England at that time, that he was in danger of losing his soul for flying that Christian cross on a secular flag. Now, what's the difference in that and that we're still arguing about the separation of church and state today? It's really the same argument.
The first argument, maybe the
Time we
first
have
public.
written, yeah. There's even a drawing of Governor Endicott with his knife cutting the cross off of the flag.
So it goes to prove you that, you know, the more things change,
They don't change at all.
the more they stay the same.
Now notice the tree's getting a lot bigger, right?
Yeah.
Okay? Now just a quick view of the English, of the Great Britain flag, because this is one most of you are used to seeing, if you've even seen one.
Yeah.
And it represents all three of the countries that make up Great Britain, which is what? England, with the red cross, Scotland, the St. Andrew cross, the X, and can you see another one in there? It's kind of hard to see. The red cross is actually on top of a white cross.
Oh.
The white cross
Wouldn't have
is
seen
the Irish flag, same symbol, just a white cross instead of a red, for St. Patrick, who's the patron saint of Ireland. Ireland didn't become part of Great Britain until 1800, so it really wasn't in the flag in the early days, but I wanted you to see the difference between the English flag, the Scottish flag, the Irish flag, and the Great Britain flag.
Well, one of the things, though, that I think is so interesting about all these flags is that, you know, when you look at them, it registers. But then when you really start looking at them, it's layered, it's deep. You know, it's not just a flag, it's a flag with meaning. And each individual thing has something that it's important that it's wants you to be reminded of, or important that stands out for the cause.
Key thing she told you there is important to you kids. You never learn everything. Don't ever think you know everything. What you learn after you think you know everything is the important stuff.
That's right.
Okay, now finally there was a guy that was part of the Continental Congress, and he came every day to the meetings. He never said anything. He didn't take part in the discussions. He was not really well known, but he always wore his uniform, and he had been involved in the French and Indian War. We didn't have a lot of people at that time. You know, they were already too old, most of them, because he had been a very young man when he was involved in the French and Indian War. He was only 20 years old. Now, he didn't have a very good experience in the French and Indian War. He was the only one that survived nearly out of the group that he was in. But when we decided to appoint a commander-in-chief of the American Army, or the Colonial Army, I guess as they called it at that time, they picked the guy with the uniform on. He was also the biggest man there. He was 6'3", which was about a foot taller than most men of that day. Who am I talking about?
Abraham Lincoln.
No.
He was a big man, though.
He was a big guy, you're right. George Washington. George Washington, and he stood up and said he was not well qualified, and he really thought that someone of more qualifications should have the job, but if they insisted, he would take it on.
And the rest is history.
Yeah, a lot of history. Well, this was the flag of the Philadelphia Light Horse Troop. You remember that this was where the Continental Congress met, was in Philadelphia, right? There was no Washington, D.C. And so the Philadelphia Light Horse Troop was the group of businessmen in Philadelphia who were wealthy by then because of the Sons of Liberty boycott of everything made in England. They loved it.
So they were providing those
This was an expensive flag here. They all had uniforms. See, most of our ancestors didn't have these uniforms. They looked more like Mike. They just had on their hunting shirts and their weapons. So this is a famous flag.
But this flag represents, I mean, so much. I mean, tell me a little bit about these particulars, so that when we start looking at flags, we're not just looking at it. Where I'm you know, is Indian?
Well,
Aztec?
The Indians had been in it. No, those were the Iroquois Indians. Their area up there. That had been very important in the early days of America because they outnumbered us. The most important thing of this flag is that this used to have the king's colors up here, the English flag. So apparently by that time somebody had painted it out, and I guess they hadn't heard of the Sons of Liberty because they didn't make the stripes red and white. They just made them blue and white. These men supposedly escorted George Washington all the way on horseback from Philadelphia to where Harvard University is today, right across from Boston in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on Prospect Hill, and they have a big monument there where that all took place. Okay? I don't think they did that. I think they escorted him out of town and went back to work. Okay, now remember I told you the tree really got big?
It's still growing.
By the time George Washington got to Boston, it was winter. We had already had the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April. We'd had the Battle of Bunker Hill in June, and everybody had gone home. It was wintertime. They had to go home.
It was tough too. I mean, they didn't have the things that we've.
They were out of ammunition. Most of them didn't have shoes.
Right. It was cold and it was snowy.
So George's first problem was supplies. And he decided that it was simpler, cheaper, faster to steal supplies from the British than it was to go try to get them from his own people. So he bought, rented, cajoled, whatever he did. He and his wife, Martha, they were the two wealthiest people in the colonies. And so they got 6 little ships, added sails to them, put little cannons on them, and sent these mariners out from mostly Marblehead and all those places up there where the sailors came from. And they said, do not get involved with the British Navy. Just try to find those supply ships that don't have any guns and bring the supplies back. Now, if you go to sea like that, and he had quite a bit of money invested by then in those 6 ships, and he didn't have a recognized flag for his country, those would have been basically pirate ships, and they could have been sold by anybody who captured them. So he had a colonel that worked for him write a letter to the Continental Congress saying, and they drew a picture and put it with the letter, and said, this will be the flag for Washington's cruisers, as they call them. He was not in charge of the Navy, so he didn't claim it to be a Navy flag. And the phrase across the top was a philosophical phrase. There was a guy like Sigmund Freud, somebody who talked about all of the astrophysical stuff, and he would always use religion when he would talk about how to solve problems, and he would always end his arguments by saying, it's just got to be an appeal to God. And so that was a phrase like, don't mess with Texas. It was so well known that they put it on the flag.
An appeal to heaven.
So that shows how religion was really intertwined with society in those days. The tree, of course, again, became almost the symbol.
The symbol.
The colonel on his own that wrote the letter added a paragraph at the end because he knew George Washington had been trying to get a national flag for months. He said, why don't you just adopt this as the American flag? They didn't even pay attention to it as far as we can tell. But don't you think it would have been interesting if we'd have had a flag with a tree on it and Canada had had a flag with a leaf on it? We might have got along a little better. Huh?
Maybe if they kept the appeal to heaven more important.
Yeah, and they concentrated on the tree more than they did the weapons. Huh? Okay, now one of the things that George also realized right away is where he's located is most important. We still have this type of a problem today. If you're working on a ship and you need to know whether the admiral is on board or not, you can look at the highest mast and they have a little blue flag up there with a number of stars that admiral raised. When you see the old World War II movies, you see a red flag on General Patton or those generals with a 2 or 3 star
Jeep, yeah, on the front of the Jeep. Yeah.
So everybody needs to know where the head guy is. So George dreamed the idea up, and this was his position flag that he supposedly designed himself. There's very little history known about this. There are 2 paintings of it, and there's one flag at Valley Forge that they think may have been an original flag. The one painting shows him at camp, and there's a flag outside of his tent. And there's another one, he's on a horse, and the guy behind him has this flag. So we call that the George Washington position flag. Guess where it flies today officially? Where George Washington is. He's buried at Mount Vernon in a crypt, and that flag is right outside of his tomb. Now this is one that most of you probably have seen if you watched the movie that was on TV this last year. John Adams, did any of you see that?
That was
a great
series.
This probably never really was a flag, but because of that movie, they've turned it into one. And of course, I had to get it as soon as it was available there. But it is an important part of our history. Benjamin Franklin became famous long before all of this took place. He was already famous in the 1740s, and it was primarily as a printer. He published a book called Poor Richard's Almanac, which was by far the largest selling magazine, book, farmer's
Pamphlet,
almanac.
yeah.
It was everything. It was everything. And he ran this picture in that almanac, and he said, join or die. And then he wrote an article complaining how none of the colonies would cooperate with each other. Have you ever heard anything like that from your mother or your teachers?
Cooperation.
Y'all don't ever have that problem, do you? That's still as true today as it was then. Notice that's kind of how they thought of the colonies at that time. Big chunks of land.
Yeah, big chunks of land.
Maine was not a separate colony. Vermont should have been. It was run separately, but it didn't want to be part of anything, and so it's not on there.
I see,
Georgia's
a
not on
common
there.
goal, but separate.
Yeah.
It's identified as a snake, but it's not put together. It doesn't function together.
That's right.
So you either join or you die. That's pretty much that flag.
Now Benjamin Franklin didn't like the eagle. He said the eagle is a vulture of the vulture family. It kills the young of other animals. It steals its food. That type of thing. He said that's not a good symbol for the country. A better symbol is what? What did he first choose? A turkey.
Oh, the turkey, yes.
He wanted to make the turkey the national symbol. He said the turkey is an honorable fowl. And he went on and on and on about the turkey, and everybody laughed at him. They said, there's even a drawing of the turkey holding arrows in one claw and all that, and his big old gobble thing hanging down, and nobody would take him seriously. So he picked another animal. He didn't give up. He said the rattlesnake is indigenous only to our part of the world. It's vigilant. That's a good qualification. Means that you're always alert. It has what you call transparent eyelids. It doesn't really sleep. It vegetates, but it always knows you're around if you're there. It doesn't strike without warning. That's what the rattle's all about. And once it does attack, you're in serious trouble. So he thought that was a great symbol. Most of the people agreed with him. They didn't care for the eagle either. The eagle was killing their sheep and things like that, like the hawk and all that.
It wasn't helping them.
So many of the militia groups chose the rattlesnake for their flag. And so this is the most famous one. You've probably seen this flag. People fly this flag. I've even stopped and asked people, do they know anything about it? And they say, no, I got it just because it was pretty. And it is pretty. It's a very attractive color, and the snake is all coiled up there. They even would label the little bitty rattler for Rhode Island, because it was the smallest colony and all that. And that little phrase at the bottom was just as important as don't mess with Texas. Same idea. We had an attitude. So this was raised by our first Navy ship. It's called the Gadsden flag, Commodore Gadsden. raised it on board the Alfred, the first American Navy ship. Guess who supposedly raised it personally? John Paul Jones.
Huh.
He claimed
would've
in
thought?
writing that he raised this flag the first time.
But it's a threatening flag, too. You
Yeah.
know, if you saw someone carrying that flag, you thought, oh, snake, might bite me.
That's right.
Oh, this even looks more frightening.
Same thing. The reason it's black and white, we don't know what color it was, so
Ah.
they just make it black and white. But it's the same basic design, except notice it has a couple of different words on it, additional words. Anybody know what those words, where they come from? Who said that? Who said,
Give me
I know not
liberty.
what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry. And he wrote this, he didn't write the speech. He said it extemporaneously at a meeting, and people hollered traitor when he said it. It was not a popular speech at all.
Because he was professing to move...
Pressing to move ahead,
To move
moving
ahead,
ahead for
to move away
independence.
from.
He was the major of the Culpeper County, that's in Virginia, militia. And my ancestor, Thomas Green, was a colonel in that militia later. He was a lieutenant when they started it. One of the oldest militias that we know about. Last
So this
one of
is
the-
your history flag right here.
That is,
That
uh-huh,
is your
yeah.
connection.
Well, I have several. See,
Well,
it's
yeah.
easier when you're looking at a 12th generation ancestor than it is for Texas when you're looking at a third generation.
Yeah, that's
you have
true.
a lot more
That's
ancestors.
right.
So a lot of us have several ancestors.
Uh-huh.
This one is my favorite of the rattlesnakes, and we're only going to show you these three. This one is the only colonial flag still in official use today. This was what's called the Navy Jack. That was the flag that flew on the bow of the ship. People fought in real honorable conditions in those days. They always had to know which was the front and which was the back of the ship. You wouldn't try to convince your enemy that you would reverse it. You wouldn't dare put this flag at the stern and try to convince them. And when they say ship of the line, they allowed everybody to line up in two lines, one coming this way, one that coming way, and they wouldn't fire at each other until they all got lined up, and then they'd come side by side and kill each other.
So they had some kind
had
of
rules.
respectful
They had rules.
for
That's
each
right.
other on killing people.
Does that give you a little better feeling for the rules y'all have to live by here at the school? Especially the ones you don't like? So this is used today on board the ships when they're in port. They fly it on the bow of the
Huh.
ship. Only one like that.
Only one.
Now, we told you a little bit before we started taping the program that this was a gorget, representing part of armor. That's what's on this flag. This is not a quarter moon or whatever you want to call it. It's a gorget. And it was a South Carolina flag. It's called the Moultrie flag for Colonel Moultrie. And it was flown at a little fort that he made. He was sent out onto a little island like Galveston Island to build a fort. There was nothing out there. Do you know that in the early days there was only one tree on Galveston Island? Nobody lived out there. There was no water out there. There wasn't anything to eat. The only time anybody went out there, the Cronco Indians would go out there when it was the oyster season. And that's probably why we eat oysters today. Can you imagine that first person that pulled that out of the water and said, I
Oh,
believe
this
I'll
looks
eat that.
good.
Doesn't look very good when you see it like that. So the Moultrie flag came about because Colonel Moultrie had nothing to build his fort with, and his men went out and drug palm trees over, and they stood them up in the sand and just piled sand on them.
Huh.
Well, Charles Lee, the general in charge at that time, came out and said, this is ridiculous. That,
It's not going to do any
palm
good.
trees
yeah.
have no strength at all. Plus, they were just a long line. He said, they'll just come around over here and fire up here and kill it. They only had 25 little cannons. They weren't sure they'd even fire far enough to hit the ships. They knew the British were coming. This was in early June of 1776. So this was pretty early in the war. Well, sure enough, the British arrived, but before they did, Colonel Lee said, I'm going to replace you. So he went back into Charleston, which would have taken a day or so to do that from Sullivan's Island where this took place. And before he could get back, the British did attack. We miraculously sank two of the British ships with those little cannons. The palm trees absorbed the cannonballs and didn't have much of an effect. The sand, really took care of. And the ship did go around the edge to fire, but it went aground on a reef, and that's where the first shot of the Civil War was fired. Fort Sumter was built on that reef out there.
So those men were fairly well validated, weren't
Yeah,
they? Yeah.
he became famous. Fort Moultrie's still out there. So that's the Moultrie flag.
But, he had a plan.
He had a problem, too, yeah. Now, this was the only battle fought in the southern part of the United States that we've kind of followed the British rules. British didn't understand why our people wouldn't fight properly. And fighting properly meant you got real close to each other, and you held your weapon, and you marched into the people while they shot you. And you stood real close so they wouldn't miss.
Oh, yeah.
You know, got to be real smart.
I would have done this.
Well, our guys did worse than that. They got behind fences and trees.
Yeah.
You know?
But that
So-
was the British philosophy,
Yeah.
yes.
And they really didn't know how to fight when we wouldn't engage them like
Uh-huh,
that. They would all line up out there and wait for us to come
They
out
were
and line
waiting
up.
for the civil
Yeah.
rules of war to
Right,
be
yeah,
engaged.
right. So anyway, what General Greene did, Nathaniel Greene, he said, well, we'll do that, but we're going to do it behind trees.
Yeah.
So they got in a wooded area. They made 3 lines, and we almost won the battle. We would have actually won the battle, but Cornwallis turned the cannons on his own army while they were engaged in an army and killed 500 of his
Oh,
own people.
my stars.
He did that so that Nathaniel
was-
Greene would retire and he could claim victory,
Oh,
because
my.
if you were the last one on the field, you could claim victory regardless of how many people you lost. Lord North, in charge of the government at that time in England, said one more victory such as that will lose the war.
Yeah.
Guess what the next battle was? Yorktown.
Oh, yeah,
So,
yeah.
this
They
was-
did. And these 3 lines signified the 3, I mean,
Well, they were the 13
Yeah, the
colonies
13
that
colonies,
were loosely gathered together then. Now, notice they don't have 5-pointed stars. There was
Yeah.
no such thing as a 5-pointed star in those early days. You had to have at least 6 points on your star for it to be qualified under the rules of heraldry from Europe. And most of the leaders knew about all of that. And so the more important you were, the more stars, the more points you had on your star.
I have lots of stars.
Now notice the flag only has 12 stripes. Now, it wasn't that we didn't like one of the colonies. It was that it was appropriate in those days to cut off a little souvenir. And so people would cut off a little piece of the bottom stripe if they were participating in that battle. You wouldn't do that today. You wouldn't think of doing that. But when you go to the museum, that's our oldest military museum, you see those little stripes people have returned back. Okay, now, finally, George Washington said we have got to have a flag. So the story is, we have no proof of this, but the story is that he left the battlefield, went back into Philadelphia, and went to see a 26-year-old widow lady who had never made a flag, and she supposedly made our first flag. Who am I talking about?
Betty Ross.
Betsy Ross, that's right. Now, why in the world would he have gone to see somebody who had never made a flag before? Doesn't make any sense, does it? Well, the story is, we don't know all of this for sure, but this is the best I can tell you, is that her husband had been killed. Her name wasn't Ross, her name was Grisham. Her husband, her dead husband's name was Ross. And Colonel Ross, his uncle, was with George Washington when they came there. So the belief of the story is that he was trying to help his nephew's widow make some money. She did own a upholstery
machine.
shop that she had inherited from her husband, so he figured she could make the stuff, and he ended up paying for the supplies. So those are the few little tidbits of documents that we have to kind of piece this story together. The better part of the story is that she didn't really know anything about all those heraldry rules. Quakers, women weren't even allowed to go to school.
To go out.
So she didn't know anything about that. So when George probably showed her a flag with, with points
stripes.
maybe like that on it or something, we don't know. She said, well, that, and he wanted it in the morning, right? I mean, when does your father ask your mother for that shirt he needs for the special meeting?
When do you ask your parents to get that special requirement for school that's due the next day? You do it the night before,
At the
right?
supper table that night, right? Yeah, well, that's probably what George did. He had to get back to the war. So Betsy said, let me show you how I can make you a 5-pointed star, and they'll all look alike, and I can sew them on tonight, and you can have your flag in the morning. So she says, here, it's like, you remember the little snowflake you made in the first grade? It's the same idea. You just fold the piece of paper properly, and then you cut off this little piece of it here. And if you cut it off, you'd make it smaller than that so you can have the right size star, but you could make 13 of these, and they would all be the same.
Same size.
And then you could stitch around them, and you could get it all made that night.
And besides, Betsy now only had 5 instead of 8
She didn't know how to do that
Yeah.
with anything but 5. So there's 2 other stories that kind of lend a little bit of proof. Her neighbor came over after George left because he needed to get back to the war, and his name was Samuel Witherell, and he said, why was George here? Everybody knew when George was in town, he was bigger than everybody else. And she told him the story, and he says, do you still have the star? And she said, yes. And he asked for it as a souvenir, and she gave it to him. Many, many years later, in 1925, one of his descendants had passed away, and they found a safe that none of the family knew he had, and when they opened it, the only thing in it was a little 5-pointed star.
Wow.
And written on it was Betsy Ross's star.
Star pattern.
So that may have been the star that she cut. They tested the material, and it was old enough to have been that old. One last story about it. The other man, have you ever seen the painting of that? There's a painting of Betsy Ross with the flag over her lap, and there's 3 men in the room. One of them, you know who it was, George Washington. The other one was her husband's uncle, General Ross. The third one was Samuel Morris, who had paid for the Revolution. He was a wealthy person, so he went everywhere to pay for the bills. And he went home that night and told his wife what they had done. His wife knew Betsy Ross. They went to the same church. She says, I know Betsy. I'm going to go over and help her sew the stars on.
Neighborly
Probably because they knew that they needed it the next morning, and she might have needed some help. Her daughter saved the dress that she wore that night, and we still have that dress in a quilt up in Minnesota.
Wow.
So none of
So
that.
these people recognized the importance
Yeah,
of the
of the
time,
flag.
the importance of what they were doing, and
The most important thing I think that Betsy did, the 5-star is just an interesting point. You used to never see a 5-pointed star. Now you only see 5-pointed stars all over the world. You hardly ever see anything but a 5-point. So a little lady that probably never went to school in her life changed
the
history.
way that we look at our flags.
Now, one of her daughters signed an affidavit years later saying that it was Betsy's idea to put the stars in a circle so that none of the colonies would seem more important than the others. Now, that's an important.
That's a point to think of and consider.
I've got one. I don't think it's in the right order, right here. How do you think Texans would have designed the star or the flag if we'd have been asked to do it? Would it have looked more like that, you think?
Yeah, that'd be Texas because we're, biggest and grandest.
This is a Texas flag from the Civil War era, and of course Texas was the big one in the middle.
Uh-huh.
So that's the.
How many stars are on that one?
Should be 32.
Uh-huh. But there's the Texas star right there. So you can claim your Texas heritage proudly. You're coded genetically to do so.
Now, one of the guys from the Continental Congress claimed that he had made the first flag. And he spent years trying to collect a bill from Congress for making it. And
For recognition
for
of
recognition
it? Just the recognition?
of actually designing the first flag. And this is his design that he said, and it has the 6 points on it like it should have. He spent years, and the government would say, no, you've got to prove it and you've got to do it. So he was the first guy that was a product of red tape in the government. And finally he gave up because all he was trying to get was a quarter of a keg of rum.
Oh, that was going to be his payment?
Pay, and they wouldn't do it.
Oh.
So this was maybe our first flag, not the other one.
Uh-huh.
He was the one that came up with the lion's idea there. Now this one is another one of that period that's famous to the ones of us who really love history and all of that. It's the Maryland 3rd Regiment of the Maryland Company. They were considered the best soldiers of the Army. And any time that Washington or his generals needed to depend on the best troops, they came from Maryland, and this was their flag. And so it became famous as the best of the best there. So this would be like a Marine Corps flag today or something like that, or the Rangers.
Because as Maryland citizens had a reputation of
well, they
being
joined up for the tour.
cause
Most of the guys didn't join up. They just had to come because they were in the militia, and as soon as that battle's over, they'd go home.
Yeah.
So they were
But
always.
these guys were in it
they
from
stayed there.
Yeah, to the end.
This is also called the Cowpens flag because that's one of the battles where they really almost defeated one of the British. Soldiers there, Bannister Tarleton.
The Cowpen?
Cowpen. It was a little fort in South Carolina named Cowpens because that's where they'd gather the wild cows and separate them there.
Well, interesting.
Okay, now we, the first Flag Act that was passed after Betsy Ross made the flag said that, and think about this now, it said that the flag will consist of 13 red and white stripes, alternating red and white, and 13 white stars on a field of blue representing a new constellation. Does this look like what they had in mind?
Well,
Qualifies, though,
it
doesn't
does. It fits your description.
Well, there was a little town in Pennsylvania that this is what they made up when they read the
Yeah.
ad, and they thought this was the flag, and so they took it into battle. They still keep it today, and they still use it as their city flag up in Pennsylvania.
So, interpretation is very important.
That's right. Does this kind of remind you of some of the mistakes you made when the teacher told you to do something and you didn't do the right thing, maybe?
You read it. You read the
read it.
directions, but it just didn't quite come out right.
Now, this one was the first flag that George Washington raised, and we're going to turn around and come over this way first.
Oh, this is a two-sided flag.
Yeah. I remember I told you to pay attention to that Queen Anne flag and that Sons of Liberty flag. Do you see where this was a combination of the two?
Mm-hmm.
So you could have easily taken 5 stripes of white material and made this out of the Queen Anne flag. Or you could have simply got the flag that existed already as the East India Tea Company flag.
Yeah.
And there's stories about both of them, so I don't know which is true.
They were recycling.
And also notice that the Irish cross is not there, just the Scottish cross and the English cross. And this was King James's cross. Who was King James? Who do y'all all know about King James? The Bible. Same guy. He had been the King of Scotland before he just, by quirk of birth, became the King of England also, because he was the closest kin at that time. And so to try to stop the inevitable fighting between Scotland and England, he took his Scottish cross and put the English cross across it, hoping that that would join the two countries together and stop them from fighting each other.
Took him a long time.
Later was when he actually called the conference together to write really the first English translation of the Bible. So this is called the Grand Union flag. Now I'll show you one Texas story because we all live in Texas. And many years later, in 1836, Stephen F. Austin wrote a letter to Gail Borden from the milk company, famous for the pasteurized milk. And Gail Borden was a member of the Congress that was going to declare independence for Texas. And he said, I think a good Republic of Texas flag would be the Grand Union flag that our grandfathers and fathers fought under, and the colors of the Mexican flag because we were part of Mexico, and the gold star that David Burnett, who was our provisional president at the time, loved so much. Most of the men didn't like Burnett, and they didn't like his gold star. So they immediately started arguing, and one of them, a man named Wharton, that the little town of Wharton is named after, said, well, instead of the gold star, let's put George Washington's head in the middle of the flag. And another one said, that's a good idea, let's put rays of light coming out of his head. And another guy, wanting to show off, started quoting Latin phrases to put across the bottom, and you can imagine the poor woman over in the corner with a needle and a thread and a pair of scissors going, oh boy. Well, they never even voted on it. So it was given to a guy named Mosley Baker from Alabama, and he led the largest group at San Jacinto, and his ancestors, his descendants, claimed that was a flag that was flown at San Jacinto. So that's a kind of an interesting connection between the American Revolution and Texas.
Combined there on one flag.
My favorite flag of all of the early militia flags is this one. Isn't that a pretty flag? Unfortunately, we don't think it exists, but it claims to be. But that's true of a lot of things. We don't know. This is called the Bennington flag. The Battle of Bennington was very important. I'll tell you a little about it in a minute, but I want to ask you something first. I've done this for probably over 20,000 children, and I've only had 2 children that know the answer to this next one, so really think hard. The grandfather of the 13th President of the United States supposedly carried this flag in the Battle of Bennington. Who was the 13th President of the United States? It always gets really quiet when I ask that. You know?
Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln was 16th. You know, used to, when I was a kid, you had to memorize every president and what number they were, and you had to say it in less than a minute. And now most of us don't even know who the 3rd or 4th one was. Can you work back? George Washington was first. Abraham Lincoln was 16. Can you work back?
No.
No. Well, I'll tell you, it was Millard Fillmore. Not a well-known name. Millard Fillmore's grandfather, Nathaniel Fillmore, supposedly carried this flag. They were losing the battle. They weren't winning. The British had come down from Canada. They had run out of supplies because of a quirk of the British. And so the British general, Johnny Burgoyne, sent his troops across the Hudson River, which is about 2 miles wide at that point, and they were to fight and steal the supplies from the people in Vermont. And so this was their flag. As they were losing the battle, an old guy came out of the green hills of Vermont, dressed much like Mike, carrying this flag. Most women say this is a flag no woman would have ever had anything to do with designing.
Yeah, it is a color combo. It's a little there.
But this old guy was so mean, he didn't care about any of that. That's why we didn't have 14 stripes on the flag, 14 colonies. He didn't want to be part of the United States. But he hated England more than he did
joining up.
So he helped out. He brought his Green Mountain Boys down and helped us. Now, that guy still has a furniture store here in the Houston area today. So who am I talking about? What member of the Continental Congress, well, he wasn't in the Continental Congress, but the colonies in the 1700s still has a furniture store in Houston?
I don't know.
Ethan Allen.
Ethan Allen.
Have you ever seen a store with Ethan Allen's name on it? Well, Ethan Allen did speak English, but he refused to do it. And he wanted to speak French, and he wanted to be part of French Canada. And when you go up there today, it really is part of Canada.
Is it?
They all speak French, and the radio's all French and everything. So this was probably one of our oldest flags. It was the flag of Vermont for a long time.
Show me one more flag that is
well, let's do this
memorable.
This moves you up a little further in time. We didn't solve the problems at the end of the Revolution just like we didn't at the end of the French and Indian War. And so we had to fight another war shortly after that called the War of 1812. Well, during the War of 1812, Commodore Perry marched his sailors, not his soldiers, his sailors overland all the way to Lake Erie, which is nearly in Canada, chopped down trees and built his own ships. Now that's quite a feat right there. Went out onto Lake Erie and defeated the English Navy, the greatest Navy in the world. That is really something. And this was the flag that was flying from the mast of his ship. This is much like Don't Mess with Texas.
Yeah, don't give up the ship.
From a captain, Lawrence, that was losing his life from wounds. His ship was sinking. His troops asked him what to do about what was the situation, and he said, don't give up the ship.
Keep working. Yeah.
That's a good motto for all
of us. It is. Come on in, because we want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you for taking the time and sharing this presentation with us. Thank you for sharing with the children the individual things on your uniforms. Now, quickly, you're both a member of Washington's Army?
But there was no such thing as a uniform, really.
So this is just what his mama came up with?
And a lot of our members have uniforms they think are like what their ancestors. But we picked these because they're pretty.
And you look good in them, gentlemen. Thank you very, very much for being here with us today and giving us this presentation. You know, there's so much information at Brazoria County Historical Museum that Michael will be so willing to help you with. It's just, our area is so rich, isn't it?
It is.
And, you know, it's just something that brings you to become a part of a community when you share the history of that community. So we thank you very much for sharing the history of the flags of the United States and flags of Texas and with us. So thank you very much again for joining us, and we hope you go out and have a blessed day.